Rebecca, just give me a thumbs up if we're ready to go. Can I just get started? Awesome. So we're going to get started. Great. So first of all, thank you so much for coming to join us today. I really appreciate it. It seems like a good crowd, and it's nice to see people from joining us from all over this country, Germany, and elsewhere. Let's just get started. I'm Joel Obermeyer, Executive Director of Widen the Circle. You're about to hear from some amazing panelists. But first, let me tell you just a little bit about Widen the Circle and why we're here. So in many parts of the world, there are people who are combating racism, anti-Semitism, and a range of other prejudice at a local level by promoting a shared understanding of the past. At Widen the Circle, our mission is to shine a light on these people and then amplify their work to broaden its impact. We started in Germany, where we're best known for the Obermeyer Awards. These annual awards honor Germans who have done profound work to preserve pieces of Jewish history and culture in Germany, in communities that were destroyed by the Nazis. Many of these same people do profound work using lessons of history to fight the rising tide of hate, prejudice, and anti-Semitism in current times. And when we talk about a rising tide of hate, look, it's clear that members of the far right in the US and Germany are key instigators. Right now, and I mean right now, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and violent racists from all over the world are chatting with each other online, right? They're encouraging and inspiring each other, and they're spreading false narratives and sharing ideologies. We want those who oppose them in the US and Germany to spend more time talking to each other and learning from one another. And that's why we're here today. This is part of our series of virtual bridge building events that feature like-minded educators and activists in Germany and the US. So we have panelists today who are from different organizations that do their work in very different ways and in different countries, but they both work in local communities where hate groups are very active. They are on the front lines countering the influence of bigoted extremists, and both are particularly focused on countering the influence of these groups, countering the influence these groups have on young people. So let's meet them now. They are Raimund Grafe and Kate Bitz. Raimund Grafe is chairman of the Association of Erich Zeigner House, or EZH, which won an Obermeyer Award earlier this year. Erich Zeigner House is located in the city of Leipzig in Saxony, an area in the former East Germany. Saxony has a high concentration of neo-Nazis, far-right groups, and voters who support right-wing political parties. One of the core initiatives of Erich Zeigner House is a year-long program for high school students. They get personally involved in researching local Jewish history and examples of resistance to the Nazis. The program instills democratic values and encourages students to become leaders in the ongoing fight against prejudice. Raimund is also a government official in the state of Thüringen and is responsible for representing that state at the national government in Berlin. He is joining us from the Erich Zeigner House in Leipzig, Germany. Raimund, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. And now let's tell you a little bit about Kate Bitz. Kate Bitz is a program manager for the Western State Center. This is one of the leading organizations in the United States that is taking on the emerging threat of white nationalism. It works to strengthen inclusive democracy with an emphasis on racial and gender justice, as well as developing leaders committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Kate focuses on community organizing, research, and local leadership development in the Pacific Northwest. Kate is joining us from Spokane, Washington. Welcome, Kate.
Hi.
Good to have you here. Another thing that Kate brings to our table is that she studied, lived, and worked in Germany for more than a decade. So she really has a perspective that kind of bridges both US and Germany, I should say. So I've been spending some time with the two of them as they've shared their experiences and ideas with each other in the past few weeks. We found that there are many important common threads in their work, and there are lessons that activists in both countries can learn from each other. After you hear from the panelists, there will be time to ask them questions in the chat. Our formal program is scheduled to run about 60 minutes. Both our guests have agreed to stay on a little bit afterward for some informal Q&A if those who want to continue with that. But with that in mind, let's just get started. So we want to focus on the work your organizations do, and we want to learn how that work relates to the challenge of white nationalism and the far right in both countries. But first, we'd like to start with the big picture of far right and white nationalists. So Kate, I'd like to start with you. Could you give us a kind of a 2-minute overview of the far right and how they've evolved, particularly in the last 5 years? I was particularly thinking about how the right wing was more out in the open in the 1990s. The response to the response to their violence forced them to change their approach, and what the white nationalists have done in response, sort of more recently. So let's hear.
Sure, I'll do my best.
No worries.
So, when I was growing up in the Inland Northwest in the 90s, a lot of the groups organizing in my area were overtly neo-Nazis, right? They were describing themselves as white separatists at the time, and they moved to the Inland Northwest because based on our demographics, they thought our idea could be turned into their own white ethno-state. And as you were saying at the time, it really was not hard to tell what a group like the Aryan Nations believed. These were guys who would show up to marches for Hitler's birthday every year wearing replica SS uniforms, quite obvious. A lot of people thought they were a joke back then, but they certainly weren't trying to hide. What we unfortunately learned during that time period is that this kind of organized hate was not a joke at all. It was very dangerous to our communities. So, for example, the Order, which was this very violent group which secretly organized at the Aryan Nations compound, went around committing a series of assassinations, bombings, and robberies around the West. When people found out that they'd been supported by the Aryan Nations, this was a clear indication that once people start organizing around this type of ideology, violence is sure to follow. At that point, especially around the late 90s and the early 2000s, people started taking the problem a lot more seriously. So after a lot of community pushback, civil lawsuits, and pressure from law enforcement, these groups did have a lot of trouble recruiting and sustaining themselves. What's important to see how we got from there to where we are now is how the far right responded to that pressure. And a lot of them did end up kind of focusing on organizing and recruiting online. Soon, a lot of them were presenting these more polished, more coded talking points about inherent racial differences, white superiority, links between race and IQ, for example. They were trying to find new ways to influence mainstream politics, and they were also networking and trading all of these ideas and talking points internationally. So this is not the aspect of the far right that I saw growing up as a kid in Eastern Washington. It's all a lot more insidious. By around 2014, 2015, people like Richard Spencer were gaining visibility. So that type of group, which called itself the alt-right, hid a lot behind irony and thought experiments. They ended up bamboozling a lot of mainstream media outlets into giving them the spotlight and credibility. So when Donald Trump was elected, they did see that as a huge win for their movement. The clearest example probably of how bold they got was Spencer giving a speech at his National Policy Institute conference in 2017, yelling, Heil Trump, Heil victory. For someone like me, this was a huge wake-up call of just how powerful they believed they were. Of course, a lot has changed since then. The violence of their ideology has been exposed over and over again through events like the murder of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville in 2017, all of the horrible mass shootings we saw in 2018 and 2019 at synagogues, mosques, and against marginalized communities worldwide. But as you can see, it has been rather effective for them to change their presentation, change their talking points, and try to become more sophisticated in their approach toward recruiting.
Yeah, and I've certainly been struck by the changes that they've made and kind of the way that the sort of broad agenda is still there, but it's so veiled. Let's hear now maybe from Raimund. Could you provide your 2-minute overview of the far right in Germany, and especially changes in the last, let's say, 5 or so years?
Sure, but perhaps it's best to start out with the end of the Cold War and German unification, because that was really a breakout moment for the German right. There was a strategic decision made to go east. And that had to do with the fact that, of course, the East still remained largely untouched by diversity and also by open civic society. This was all new. And so this decision to build a broad base in the East was quite successful the moment this was coupled with the deindustrialization that took place in the early 90s with mass unemployment. And this gave the right a real opportunity, which it seized to be successful at the ballot box. And in the late 90s, they were successful in a number of Eastern states. In Sachsen-Anhalt, for instance, the DVU suddenly got 13% of the vote. And then in 2004, the NPD, 10% in Saxony. And this was really quite stunning. People had never expected the right to be successful and to enter the legislatures. Right.
And am I right? The right really, many of these were groups that had been active in West Germany, but just hadn't gotten that kind of traction before. Is that right?
Well, there had been some traction in the 60s, right? But that was ancient history for most of us, and of course that was not a sustainable thing. It disappeared relatively. So people were used to the fact that there were all these crazy right-wing groups that somehow we're trying to preserve something, in spite of the fact that it had so clearly failed in Germany. And here now suddenly there was this renaissance of the right in the East, and with electoral successes. Now, okay, 10%, that's 10%, but then something happened in 2015, which was the opening of German borders to immigration. And that infused a lot of life into the right, particularly in the East. And we've now seen in the past few elections results of about 25%. So that's a quarter of the voting population. And that's a real big change because while the Alternative for Germany, that is the sort of catch-all party, that has been having these successes, they don't have a path to governing because no other parties are willing to go into a coalition with them. But they are with 25% able to really push their agenda. They are considerable. The media does need to report on them. The ability of a quarter to 1/3 of a population to really be very, very open about how it feels on all the issues, and to also be able to really influence the national debate. That is something that has really changed. And of course, this provides an umbrella for all the other groups that are, of course, still out there and that are being, formed and that disappear. This is an umbrella for all these groups. Many small, free brotherhoods that are out there, but also for self-proclaimed movements such as the Identitarian Movement, which is active both in the United States and in Germany. And also the so-called Reich citizens who have become increasingly prevalent and who maintain that the German Reich still legally exists. And for that reason, they do not cooperate with German authorities and do not pay taxes. So all of these.
Raimund, my understanding is that you both have this new activism in politics because of this kind of support, and that there's also a whole element, kind of another element that's still veiled, that's still not as out in the open. Is that right?
Yes, but of course, even that sort of subcultural, neo-Nazism has, been quite empowered by the successes of the AfD in elections, and it's no longer as veiled as it was, 5 years ago.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it seeps into many different areas, such as, for instance, into sports, for instance, particularly martial arts is a big thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And
Hold on for a second, because I would like to move forward to talking about kind of shared and core beliefs. What do these groups have in common in Germany and the US? Kate, I'd like to start with you. First, I'd like to hear about that. And I guess one of the things that's been particularly striking to me is the role that anti-Semitism plays in these kind of set of beliefs. So why don't you give me maybe a quick summary of how you see those things, and then we'll hear from Raimund also.
Sure. And especially in order to explain the core role that anti-Semitism plays, I'm going to take you all on a little bit of a longer walk through their ideology.
It's okay. Bring us on the journey.
Right. So hopefully this will be helpful in explaining kind of the systemic role of all of that. The core goal of the far right at this point is essentially to turn their country into an ethno-state. And we can take a look at that across borders as well, right? So for the United States, what they are talking about is turning the United States into a white country. In Germany, they're talking about ensuring that, quote unquote, Germany is for the Germans, right? This framework involves restricting immigration. It involves the idea that essentially the rights and privileges of citizenship and human rights are only afforded to people who are in the right ethnic group. So for this to even make sense, you have to have a few core ideas already in mind if this is your ideology, right? One is that race is one of the main ways that we understand human difference, right? Race is meaningful. You also have to believe race is natural. It comes from nature, it's immutable. Third, you have to make the jump to believing that the white race is superior to all others, biologically and culturally. You know, culture is taken as a racial characteristic. And that's often also extended to this idea that the white, straight, cis man is the pinnacle of human potential and the natural ruler over all the rest of us. So, of course, I can almost see you thinking like, I need to open my mouth to argue against this, Joel, because it's so ahistorical. The easiest way to look at this is just, you can take it apart by looking at history, right? If white men are natural rulers, well, how did the civil rights movement change our political system? If races are inherently different, what are Raimund and I even doing? Why do people find solidarity with each other? Why do we stand up for each other across these barriers of race and nationality? So to smooth over that contradiction, the far right turns to conspiracism, and specifically to anti-Semitic conspiracism. White nationalists believe that there is a vast international Jewish cabal that controls corporate media and international finance. They believe that this cabal is engaged in a conspiracy to eradicate white Christians. So in this inevitable battle of the races that they believe must be waged, people of color are the foot soldiers, whereas they see Jews as the generals. This extends to their current ideas about what they call the Great Replacement, or in German, der große Austausch. So the idea that immigration is being directed by powerful people who want to make Western countries less white. Typically, the coded way that you hear this today is the idea that like George Soros is funding movements for justice and telling protesters, civil society groups, and progressive politicians what to do. And this belief system seems fanciful, right? It seems very far-fetched. However marginal this remains, though, it is really dangerous. These groups might not be able to win their whole agenda, but they can do a lot of damage in the process of trying.
Yeah, Kate and Raimund, before I started learning more about these topics and hearing more about them from you, honestly, I don't think I fully appreciated the central role that anti-Semitism plays in this set of ideologies. So thank you for that explanation. Raimund, I'd like to turn to you in a second, but before I do, I just want to mention to everyone that you can post questions whenever you have them in our chat. Most of the questions will probably wait until the end to, in the Q&A section. You don't have to wait if there's something you want to put in there. Okay, Raimund, can you tell me to what extent are the far-right groups in Germany and the US communicating with each other and influencing each other? Oh, actually, was that for Raimund? Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I think it's important to add one thing to what Kate has said about the core that's common to both. It's not just a question of ideas. It's also a question of common tactics, common approaches, and that's what they are communicating about. Yeah? They are trying out different things and finding them to be successful, and they're talking about how to take those successes, the other side of the respective Atlantic. I think one of the common things that they both feel is that they are somehow resistance movements. There is this feeling of victimization, which is quite strange. If you are the pinnacle of evolution, why should you suddenly become a victim? I mean, there's something, you've obviously done something wrong as a pinnacle of evolution if you then end up as a victim.
Sure.
But this idea of being in resistance, of course, is something that, this is a common theme that goes back, to the old Nazis and also to anti-Semitism, which is that this is a resistance against the whole idea of modernism, with everything that goes along with that, including, the emancipation of women and, industrial culture, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all old motifs that are being recycled in a, with a very modern and glossy packaging. Right. And both sides of the Atlantic are working on how to do this.
Yeah. Let me interrupt just for a second. And this is really, I just want to get a little bit more perspective from you, Kate. In terms of the the communication and influence that's going on between, these far right in the US and Germany, my understanding is some of this is kind of accelerated more recently. And I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit more sense of kind of what's going on now, groups meeting each other, the kinds of things that you've talked to us about.
Right. I mean, I think what Gaimon's saying is really significant in terms of the fact that there's always been some cross-pollination, right? Before the United States entered the Second World War, we really had our own fairly significant homegrown fascist movement, which was inspired by European fascism. We forgot that really quickly once we were, as a nation, at war with Nazi Germany, but it was there, One contemporary example that I think is so interesting, and Gaimon brought them up earlier, is the Identitarian Movement. So this is essentially a rebranding of white nationalism as this activist resistance youth movement, started in France, spread all across Europe, and gained a foothold here in the United States as well. So what you can trace over about the past 5 or 6 years is these groups really traveling to meet up, even participating in shared projects like trying to harass refugee boats in the Mediterranean. They interview each other on their YouTube channels. They share all of these talking points, especially the idea of the Great Replacement, which animated quite a few of the mass shootings that we saw in the past few years. So another real change, I think, is that these far-right political parties and factions, as they gain power in the political system, this creates the framework for them to also start meeting up and exchanging ideas and information. So we've seen this and tracked it with specific figures in the Republican Party in the United States. There were meetings between, for example, some ambassadors and members of Congress and members of the AfD.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Kate should point specifically to the Identitarian Movement, because there the link is in fact even familial, because one of the main Identitarian leaders, I think, of the Austrian Identitarians is married to an American woman who is also very active. And
yeah,
I think
from my neighborhood, basically. Yes.
I think they met at some Identitarian event in Europe.
Yeah. So basically, there's all this interchange going on, and I think, well, anyway, I think it's a really helpful summary of the challenges that we face and kind of the history that we're dealing with. Since we've done that, I would love for us to now turn to what the two of you in your respective organizations and so on are doing about this. So I think So we started with Kate before. Raimund, I'm going to start with you. Erich Zeigner House is in a part of Germany where right-wing extremists try to appeal to young people. How does Erich Zeigner House diminish their appeal?
Okay. I mean, we're dealing with young people who are often exposed to right-wing narratives in their local environment. This is at home. This may be, in the sports club, sometimes in schools, and some of this may be, quite innocuous to them at the beginning. Young people are not aware where certain ideas and prejudices come from and where they will potentially lead you to. And that's where history comes in with the story of how German democracy collapsed in the 1930s, and how incremental increases in exclusion, ostracism, and marginalization in the 20s and the 30s ultimately led to the Holocaust. So German history is where we can see how these small changes ultimately add up to the great tragedy. And we're able to tell this story to young people in an authentic setting. This is the Erich Zeigner House. It's the home, library, and the workspace. That's where I'm sitting right now.
Yeah, are you sitting in the library or the workspace?
I'm sitting in the library, but also there's the desk of Erich Zeigner and his picture right behind me, a photograph of him. And he was a prominent German politician in the first half of the 20th century, fought for democracy in the 20s and 30s, and then headed a resistance group during the Nazi era in this in this space. This resistance group was involved in creating a safe house for Jewish citizens that were trying to leave the country.
But didn't he help smuggle some of them out?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
There's a term for this called the rescue resistance. And it's actually something that more Germans were involved in than one thought for a long time. So there's actually a network of safe houses that was involved in this. And one of the safe houses was the Erich Zeigner House. So we have an authentic place with which to do project work with young people. In fact, the resistance group met around a table, which I'm just looking at. It's on the other side of the camera. Mm-hmm. And this is the table where we do project work with young people. And of course, that's...
Can I ask you just to add something to that? Because I think, honestly, this is an important point for us in a way, which is that there's great power for young people and others to encounter history where it actually happened. We're in real proximity.
It's small. Like I put them on the little trays, them little black trays, like this tray I haven't seen.
Sounds like there's somebody who has unmuted. There we go. That sounds better. So Raimund, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the power of being at the place where history happened and how it helps impact young people, which is something that we've thought about quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, students, leave their classroom context and they're able to come and in this authentic space, will feel some of the impact of history. These are extracurricular school projects that students commit to for a year. And what they do is they research by themselves the biography either of a local victim of the Nazis, be that victim Jewish, Roma, disabled, or political, or they research the biography of one of the quiet heroes who were involved in the rescue resistance. And at the end of each such project, there stands a concrete result in the shape either of a so-called stumbling stone, which is then set in the sidewalk in front of the house where the victim lived before he was taken off to concentration camp, or we put up a plaque on the house where the quiet hero that was involved in the resistance lived. So this authentic place where history happened, coupled with research by students, historical research in archives, for instance, creates a real feel for history and an emotional proximity also to the people that they research.
Sure. My understanding also is the philosophy behind this is really one about of autonomy, meaning students taking responsibility for their own projects. Did I understand right that students actually raise money for the stumbling stones to be placed? They, maintain them afterward, those kinds of things.
Yes, this is an important part of the project, of interacting with the local community, not just doing the project, but also talking to people. And as one talks to people in the area or the houses where the stumbling stones are laid out in front of, yes, they ask for donations, and these donations are then used to fund the projects. So this is a part of the entire design of the project.
And I guess I'd like to mention something else and just hear kind of your approach to this, which is that, as I understand it, the local history work sometimes takes place in your hometown, Leipzig, but also in rural areas nearby in Saxony, where I understand the far right is even more popular sometimes than in the city. And could you maybe talk briefly about a few of the special challenges of working in those areas? Because I think it's hard for an American to understand how hostile some of these places are sometimes.
Yes, I mean, in some ways, Saxony is like Idaho. It's small rural communities where there's little awareness of local history. There's little knowledge that before World War II there were Jewish communities, not just in big cities, in urban areas, but in a lot of small towns across the country. And so there's little sort of historical knowledge to build on, little awareness. And due to the fact that there's been quite a demographic shift in the past 20 years away from the rural areas into the urban areas, there's been an erosion of local groups in general that are active. And so it's very difficult to find cooperation partners for our projects. But what's, I think, even a bigger challenge is just this atmosphere of intimidation that the right, has managed to create in some of these areas. There are threats. There is, of course, in area, small towns, everybody knows everybody. So if you get involved in one of these projects, people will approach you and ask you whether, you think that's a good idea, right? So there is fear sometimes of getting involved in these projects, and particularly of organizing openly.
Right. Now, my understanding is, though, when you are able to carry out these projects, often you can see real significant change in people's attitudes. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, once we stick to it and actually bring one of these projects to conclusion, I mean, people are actually quite they change their minds, and they feel this is a good thing because their history, their local history is being given back to them, and there's a lot of admiration actually for the young people. That they have, done a good thing, that they have, become engaged in this way, and that they have really, done something good for the community.
Great. So, Ryman, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. I have more questions I'd love to ask you. I just want to make sure we don't get a chance to kind of get through a few of the topics that I think people want to hear. So let me turn to Kate, please. Kate, you're at the Western State Center, and it has a different approach and a different mandate. Can you give me just a 1 to 2 minute version of how you were trying to counter the white nationalist threat at the Western State Center?
Sure. So I will do my best to explain this in terms of our 4 pillars that we do across our different programs, which are leadership development, narrative shift, culture shift, and defending democracy, and they all overlap. So leadership development is how I personally got involved with the center originally. I ended up doing a Defending Democracy Fellowship back in 2018. This is a 6-month program that teaches people how to organize against the far right. And we're dealing with a lot of the same factors that Gaimon described in terms of, people being afraid to organize openly, worrying about threats, not knowing where to get started, right? We then take people who are at the beginning or middle of their careers and are already concerned about the set of issues, give them some tools for systemic analysis, and get them out in the field figuring out how to make a difference. So my big win during my fellowship was exposing a local Republican Party leaders meeting with a white nationalist who had marched in the Torchlight March at Charlottesville. Her own party subsequently convinced her to resign from leadership. My mentees have done a lot of amazing things of their own. They've held workshops, they've organized protests, all kinds of really great stuff. And we're essentially really focused on building capacity for people to stand up to the far right and build that counter narrative and counterweight in their own communities. As you can tell, leadership development overlaps a lot with our defending democracy work. So that's often a lot of conversations with local government and civic institutions like libraries and schools. Narrative shift, we work a lot with the press. As I was mentioning, it was really hard for mainstream institutions to kind of interpret what was going on back during the rise of the alt-right, I suppose. And we just have a lot of conversations, pass on a lot of research to give that view. Lastly, culture shift is really important too. So we work with artists and musician cohorts who also get an education and understanding of some of these issues and translate them into the medium of artistic expression. I'm going to drop a Spotify playlist in the chat from some of our inclusive culture lab participants who write songs about some of this now.
Sounds good. Kate, let me do this. Let's get more specific if we might. I'm going to go a little out of order here, but can you briefly explain one or two ways that you work with local communities yourself to deal with right-wing threats? Maybe an example of your approach at the grassroots level?
Yeah, this is a lot of my day-to-day work. So I'm going to give you a slightly vague example of something that I'm in the middle of right now. Often we tell these stories where everything has already been handled, and I don't think that really captures how it works. Okay. So a white nationalist organization in a community that we support has been putting out stickers and kind of spray painting their logo all over the place for years. I've been receiving pictures of this regularly. People are already annoyed by it. But recently, this small group escalated to defacing a mural, which was painted on a shop in honor of George Floyd. Essentially, the Derek Chauvin verdict came down, and their response was to go deface this shop. And there's a lot of moving pieces in a situation like that, right? People really want to know, who are these hate group members? Like, can we find them? Can they be prosecuted for this? What about the mural? Can we rebuild it? If we do, how do we protect it? This is actually the second time it's been defaced. What's the local news saying? All of these different things. But my biggest priority has just been to figure out and keep on top of what the shop owner needs. He's a man of color. He put up this mural because he believes in racial justice. It has now been destroyed twice. And if I start to steamroll him into dealing with all those questions I listed above, that would mean that I'm not doing right by him and his needs.
Sure.
We met up a couple of weeks ago. We just chatted about what he's been going through and thinking. And I really wanted to understand, what's it been like to have this mural in the spotlight over the past year, to have it damaged twice, I wanted to be taking some of these issues off his plate instead of giving him the work of managing this whole situation on his own. Yeah. So what that generally looks like is making a lot of offers of support, making a lot of suggestions, and then giving people that time and space to figure out what they have energy for and what they want. Yeah, it's something that I could talk about for ages, because this is not really something that happens on the news cycle type of timeline. It requires a lot of investment in relationships and in trust building.
Right. And I hate to say it this way, but I think the need for relationships and trust building, is something the far right has already figured out. And you can't, anyway, so, it's needed. before I turn, I want to talk to both of you, bring up some questions to both of you and open it up. Before I do that though, Kate, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to at least give us a brief taste of the handbook about white nationalism in schools. This is for schools and teachers that the Western State Center has created. I know it cites tactics that have worked in schools. And anyway, can you just give us a brief taste about that?
Sure. So our toolkit, Confronting White Nationalism in Schools, this was co-authored by 2 educators, and it provides framing and research for pretty much all stakeholders in the school system. So whether you're an educator, an administrator, a student, a parent, a concerned citizen, it offers some approaches to this really difficult problem of kids getting interested in white nationalist ideas and groups. And the key thing to mention there, again, is that this type of ideology has consequences very quickly. So in any situation like that, we always advocate that the school figures out how to deal with the very negative and often intimidating behavior that comes along with that. You know, our classmates of color hearing nasty things from someone. LGBTQ kids are often harassed by their peers who are expressing white nationalist ideas, right? So that's kind of the key. And that boundary and standard setting in the classroom and in school settings is also, in the experience of the educators that we work with, one of the best ways to help kids get out of that echo chamber of white nationalism. So we've talked a lot today, you know, about contemporary white nationalists dressing up their racist claims in these kind of pseudo-scientific talking points. That has unfortunately led to situations where kids take all of that as completely factual.
Right.
They've been cited in their school papers.
No, that makes sense.
In this one case, a student was starting to cite Richard Spencer's writing.
And Richard Spencer is this key member of the...
a key figure in the alt-right.
Yep.
You know, and his writing does come across as quite academic if you ever take a look at this crap. So the teacher responded by putting together kind of a set of more rigorous standards for everyone to use in the classroom as far as what kind of sources students could cite. By that, the educator was able to ensure that the student individually benefited by understanding why a white nationalist source wasn't to be taken seriously, and also made that space for all the current and future students to learn some really important lessons around media literacy and valid sourcing.
Right. One of the things that struck me about the handbook, and actually, let me just interrupt for a second. So for those who are on this, in this event who are interested in seeing the handbook, we're gonna put a link to it in chat, and it'll also be available on the event page we have on our website later on. Anyway, I was struck by the, you know, sort of the handbook virtually always suggests kind of very aggressive and very important set of actions to take. But at the same time, it's not really focused about punishment of students who do things like spreading white nationalist propaganda, because it seems like there's so many different ways kids can get pulled into that. You can't make a blanket statement to blame them. You know, it just depends, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. So let's do this. I want to bring Raimund back as well. You know, we've talked a little bit longer than I thought because we had so many interesting things to talk about. I want to bring you guys together for a couple questions, and then I think we'll have to make sure we hear from some folks in the audience. Go ahead, Raimund.
Yeah, may I just,
since
Kate and I are also comparing toolkits across the Atlantic,
sure.
Also mention that, you know, the Erich Zeigner House has also, you know, done a handbook by Henry Lefkowitz. He's our managing director, and it does much the same thing. It provides a lot of guidance for groups, small groups that want to get involved, and a lot of, you know, just basic, you know, hands-on tips about how to go about organizing. And for instance, you mentioned the collection of donations for the projects. You know, how does one go about something like that?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And so, you know, we've done much the same thing because we know we want to, you know, reach more people than we can just by our own efforts. I just thought I'd mention the fact that we also have, you know, much the same thing here.
Totally fair. No, that's great. Thank you, Raimund. So I'm going to switch to some broader issues. I don't think we have time for more than 2 more questions before we go to, you know, people in general. But here's one that I really had been really hoping to put in front of both of you. So look, We live in a world where social media provides new tools to popularize what we now know are supposed to know are called alternative facts, right? Which actually are just lies. There's distorted versions of reality. One of them is Holocaust denial or minimizing the importance of the Holocaust. Can you talk a little bit about how you deal with young people who believe in distorted versions of history? And Raimund, I'm particularly interested if you could briefly tell the story about the student and the archive who didn't believe it was real. So Raimund, could you maybe start? Kate, I might turn to you afterward.
Sure. Well, there is this problem that, some students feel, okay, some kind of propaganda is being foisted on them, right? This is, a way to get them to look at things in a way that, they've certainly heard something else at home.
You mean getting involved in your project would be kind of a form of propaganda? Is that what you're saying?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So, we're talking about Holocaust denial, and there's, there are people even without denying it, who relativize it, say, well, it wasn't what it was said to be, and Germans were not as involved in all of this, certainly not everybody, et cetera, et cetera. So the important thing about our projects, of course, is that it forces students to do independent research and to find out for oneself. So it's not a question of accepting something that we tell them, but this is something that they have to find out about themselves. So the important thing is to go into an archive. And we did have a case where a student in the Leipzig archive said, well, it's obvious. These archives are, totally fake. This archive has been created by the allies of World War II to create a certain legend that is then perpetuated. So it's a forgery. Basically, he was saying this entire archive.
And just for a quick sense, Raimund, this is a pretty large archive, right?
Oh yes, it's the archives of the city of Leipzig. 600,000 people. It's an important city in Germany with a very great history, right? And it's a huge archive. So he says, well,
when he says that, what do you do?
Well, we said, well, do you really think you are so important that one would go to all this trouble, to forge an entire archive, so that you would believe something else than what the truth is? We sort of put the question back, and I think what you need to do is you need to create an awareness on the students' part of just how absurd the whole situation is. So you argue ad absurdum. Okay, you take things by asking questions to their absurd conclusions, which is that, imagine, if you were to forge all this stuff, how difficult that would be. Imagine the inordinate effort, not just to forge an archive, but also to, keep that a secret. All the people that must be involved in this entire thing. So, this is the thing, that's why conspiracies are so absurd. Because for conspiracies to work, they need to be done by very small groups of people, right? And they need to be very secret. But forging and how can a conspiracy work that is so large, right? That it would actually work, right? Yeah. So basically, we do then talk to them about this whole conspiracy idea that's behind this, and we just take it to its absurd conclusions by just asking questions and explain,
Right. And I guess one thing I'll point out, and then probably need to move forward, is just it's interesting to me that how for both of you, so Raimund, you just mentioned a case, the response is not punitive, right? You're not punishing the student. You're helping him question things. You're trying to figure out the logic behind it. Where's it coming from and so on. But it's not about pure punishment. And I think that's, I think
Let me also say it's not just about that person itself. It's about creating a kind of peer pressure, okay? Because you're trying not to influence that person, but the other students in the group who then will say, what's wrong with you?
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Right. If you're already dealing with folks who are being taught by the far right that they are in a victim position, punishment is really quite dangerous. It's a very delicate balance.
And the reason I'm mentioning is just for like a school administrator or something like that, or as a parent, you almost want to hear about the punishment because that's what you expect. But I think it's interesting that, the two of you are much more involved in this, for example, than I might be, really have kind of a similar view on this. So that's really helpful. So I have some more questions, but I think I'm going to skip them for now so that somebody else in the audience can get one in. So let's do this. Let's turn to other people's questions. Please, if you have a question, enter it into chat, although I think a lot of them have. And in order to cover as many as possible, which I think is only going to be a few, Dan will be moderating and reading questions. So I'm going to bring in Dan. Hi, Dan. Good to have you here. And just so everybody knows, our two speakers have agreed to stay on beyond the hour, so the 60-minute mark, to talk with others who have questions. So we will end the event on time at 60 minutes. But if you have a question and you really want to talk it through, we're happy to stay here for you. But let's start. Dan, what do you got?
One question is how strong are unemployment rates or badly paying jobs to a rising right-wing movement in the US? I think the same thing applies to Saxony and East Germany as well.
So is sort of economics kind of a key driver? Is that the question, Dan?
Yeah, how important is unemployment and low wages in this in the power of the right wing?
Raymond, you want to try that one?
Yes. Well, I mean, the sense of sort of general economic dislocation, low wages, and it's not just a question of wages. I mean, there's an entire way of life, the industrial way of life with all its social aspects that has disappeared, and that gave people a sense of place and identity. And I think it's not just a correlation between how much you earn, and what you think. But what we've seen in the East is deindustrialization, and that is not just an economic, but it's also a cultural fact. And the right has been able to take advantage of that.
Kate, I'm curious, do you see parallels in the US?
I sort of do, yeah. My understanding, and I'm not a sociologist, I'm someone who started out in urban planning and then ended up somehow doing this political organizing work full time. Sure. My understanding is that it's a lot more about relative status and perceived status loss than it is about absolute, for example, poverty. In the United States, where we have such huge racial disparities in terms of housing quality, healthcare, wages, our politics would look very different if the general tendency were for the most marginalized people to stand up against the political system, right? Shula actually brought this up in chat also, that after January 6th, we learned that a lot of people who showed up at the insurrection were flying there in private jets, members of the middle class. And that reflects, I think, is people worried that they will not be on top of the status hierarchy anymore, which is a rather different question from deindustrialization in general. That said, however, I mean, it's really hollowing out, I think, the power of civil society to respond, that many of the people who, the volunteer leaders who I work with, often are trying to work multiple jobs at the same time as they're trying to stand up to the far right in their communities. So that is certainly a dynamic.
Sure, that makes sense.
And it also, I mean, it's also clearly something that plays into reaction against immigration, in the sense that the right says you need to take care of Germans first, and before we remember that, of course, Germany has a very, very tight social net, a very good social security, welfare state. And so, yes, yeah.
So
Germany first argument is quite powerful.
So I'm going to interrupt us for a second because I want to make sure people who really need to go down to their next thing, we're able to get through the end of kind of the official part of the event. So give everybody who's got questions, give us a few minutes. We'll circle back for those who can stick around because I know there are a lot of questions that have been roaming around on the chat. But before we do that, I do want to thank our guests. Thank you, Raimund. Thank you, Kate. We want to keep this conversation going on both sides of the Atlantic. And
Yep.
I should just say that we're planning more events like this in coming months. And we'll let you know about them well in advance. And I hope those of you who are here will join us. I want to close this formal part of the event by just making an observation. There are no easy answers to the threats from the right, from right-wing hate groups. And this problem, unfortunately, is not going away. But I find it really inspiring to know that people like Kate and Raimund are out there working hard to stop the extremists from spreading hatred in communities. And they give me more hope for the future in both countries. So please, for those of you who are here, consider following Widen the Circle on Facebook or Instagram, or come to our website, widenthecircle.org. We'll be sending all of those who signed up for this event a very short survey shortly. It would really help us out if you would fill it out. And in case you missed it, Rebecca has put the download link for the Western States Center Handbook on dealing with white nationalism in schools in the chat. She's also sharing the link to the Erich Zeigner House story, which is on our website. I'm going to use this as a mark for the official end of our time together, the official part of our event. As I said, I know there are questions we haven't gotten to, and our speakers have offered to stay for another 15 to 20 minutes. So those who are able and would like to remain on the Zoom call, please do. Otherwise, those of you who need to leave right on time, thank you for joining us, and we'll start again in another 20 seconds or so. All right, that's almost 20 seconds. Dan.
Another question was, there was a comment about the impressive work that Erich Zeigner does with the emotional engagement of high school students with the biographical projects, but any thoughts of the panelists about how to accomplish that kind of engagement by adults? We've been talking a lot about kids here. Well, what about the older generation?
Okay.
Raimund, we can start with you because you look like you're ready to speak first.
Yes.
Yeah, well, we do projects for adults as well, and those are mainly evening discussions on more general questions of how to deal with the right. One thing we found is that those of us who value an open society and democracy, we've become a little bit, how should I put it, flabby in our argumentation, because I think Kate pointed out that the right is not, just a bunch of kooks, but they have some smooth talking and smooth argumentation out there that does address some of the, core issues of the world we live in. And we need to be, up to the mark argumentatively.
Yeah.
And so that's what we do dealing with adults, is to sharpen our terms. Okay, how do we frame our agenda? Okay, how do we counter the specific arguments? And maybe we have come to take democracy and the core values we believe in as somehow for granted, and they are being put into in question. And we need to sharpen our weapons here.
Great. Kate, do you have anything you want to add? It's okay. Yes or no is fine, either way.
Yeah, I think a lot of this work we end up doing with people who are already quite committed. So a lot of this happens in our leadership development programs and our cohorts, those type of learning experiences. What's great to see is our cohort members going out and doing that kind of emotional work in their own communities, bringing people together for discussions, you know, starting campaigns that are about having inclusive local business. That's really something where I see a lot of our fellowship graduates doing amazing things these days.
Great.
Questions for
Dan, hold on, let me interrupt. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to throw in a quick question. So Raimund, look, you know, and actually Kate, you also know that, you know, part of the things we do at Widen the Circle is looking at the question of how, you know, local history projects and things like that have a key role in changing people's attitudes. And I think you've given a sense of us a sense of that from Erich Zeigner House. I'm turning to you, Kate, in a way, because we talked a little bit about this issue previously, and, you know, sort of the role that history might play in dealing with these issues here in the US. And honestly, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you this question. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you view it as well.
Yeah, I think I was always somewhat aware of this, but through preparing for this event, it really made me think about the fact that when we talk about alternative facts in the United States, we're also talking about a lot of the way that many people have been taught about our history. You know, downplaying some of the ugly things that have happened in our past. A lot of our, you know, landscapes in the United States are still dominated by questionable things like monuments to figures in the Confederacy. Sure. So we are kind of dealing with an accretion of fake history or alternative facts that people, you know, it didn't require a conspiracy. They put all of this out there in the open on purpose to mislead people and lead them in a direction that can certainly get people interested in white nationalist ideas. I think it really requires a lot of thought about both curriculum that we're teaching kids, and also about the landscapes of our cities. Like, we need to be doing that critical work for people to have a sense of what has really happened in our country and where we go from here. Makes sense.
Well, go ahead, Raimund.
Let me just pick up with one sentence. I think memory is also a space that needs to be, well, we're fighting for, you know, who frames historic memory.
Yep.
Whose story is told, right? Yeah. Whose story gets told and whose story is not told.
Right, and as, again, this is part of our shtick in a way, but, you know, we know that history, as it's been told, particularly if it's history that's really close up to you, has a very powerful impact on students and adults. All right, I used my prerogative. Dan, go ahead.
Well, there was a question about, I'm not sure it's fair to ask how you're addressing it, but there was a comment about how the extremists have penetrated law enforcement and military culture and organizations. We saw this in the United States, obviously, with the number of cops in the demonstration on the Capitol, and of course there was a major case in Germany, Raimund, about the German military being having people affiliated with the far right. So, are you worried about that? Is that something that can be addressed? How are we going to deal with it?
Okay, yeah. Well, obviously these cases, you know, are reasons to be worried. But I personally think that in Germany, particularly, and these are of course lessons, you know, that were learned and were institutionalized in Germany, that this will not, you know, carry the day. I think the way the German military works, there are a lot of safeguards in place. The whole idea of citizens in uniform, that's the German phrase, is still very much out there, particularly in the military leadership. And I would hope that these are, you know, cases that we need to worry about, but that this is not.
So you don't see it as that much of a major problem then?
No, I mean, I think also one of the real, one of the reasons this has now come up is of course that, it's very difficult to get weapons in Germany. It's different from the United States. There are no weapons out there. So if you want to, do any kind of mischief, one of the places that you might be able to, procure weapons or bullets is, through the military. So it's just one of the ways to do that. And that's the case that, was now in the media in Germany, where some people in the army were starting to, well, there were some guns missing and some munition missing.
So just to kind of balance out this question, Kate, I'm just going to turn to you for a second. I was going to say, I don't think you have to validate the question about whether they're sympathizers to right-wing causes in, the police and other places. I think you don't have to establish that, because I think a lot of us saw it with our own eyes. I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we address it.
Yeah, I think when you look at the German cases, and of course, because of my background, I get asked about this a lot too. Like, wow, isn't it scary? What's going on over there? The thing is that Germany has more structures to expose and address this sort of thing, and we really don't. So I think that's where you see a high visibility of this problem in Germany.
But hold on. Let me just
right.
make sure I get this. So
what I'm saying is, I don't think we know the shape and the structure of that problem in the United States.
Okay.
Yes, it's been really good to see, national leadership starting to talk about this, starting to do a stand down order, Homeland Security officials looking into what is the penetration of this type of thing inside of those forces. A lot of it is tone at the top. A lot of it is leadership. A lot of it is helping leadership to understand that when I pick up the phone and talk to people who are facing a hate incident or a hate crime, people who have threats, that they certainly should be reporting to law enforcement. Often the very people who are doing this work on the ground, being very courageous, doing what they can to make a positive difference, are not comfortable going to law enforcement with their concerns. And it's the accumulated cost of that I think officials really have to start thinking about if we're going to make a change.
Makes sense. Dan, another question.
Several people wanted to know, Shula Reinhardt started, we have learned that to understand groups, you should trace the money trail. Who funds these groups? Where are the resources coming from?
Kate, you're nodding, so maybe I'll start with you this time.
This is a really big question, and I think the answer is as diverse as who funds civil society groups working for inclusive democracy. So one big thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these guys just sincerely hold these views and also have money. People spend money on things that they care about. So often the answer is as simple as someone has money to put together their little plate carrier outfit, their AR-15 collection, and their big truck with a 3%er sticker on the back, and that is what they're choosing to spend their personal funds on. There's also some really long-standing kind of foundations and so-called charitable institutions that fund a lot of these groups. Western States Center has put together a tracker regarding like anti-immigrant groups, many of whom get their money actually from the 20th century American eugenics movement. I will stick that in the chat because I think it's very illuminating as to where some of the bigger money comes from.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that these right-wing groups, certainly in Germany, are also, involved in a lot of economic activity, right? So they have, music, publishing houses. They're, have a lot of, martial arts places. There's a lot of economic activity, and some of that is just simply organized crime. So there is a gray area between the right and organized crime, frankly. Okay, so some of that money is money that they're making and they're washing, and it does not come from donors, but is part of an economic activity that they have managed to establish.
Let me throw out one more question, which is, I'm wondering, look, I mentioned this earlier in the event, but the three of us met a couple of times before this event, just to give you two a chance to talk to one another and potentially to figure out what you might be able to learn from one another. I was wondering if each of you could just give, just a hint to folks who are still on about the kind of things that you learned or you're interested in pursuing that you heard about from your counterpart. Kate, you're smiling. I'm going to go to you first.
I'm smiling too, though.
Oh, well, okay, fair enough.
Yeah, no, it's really funny because we've just been having this intense email conversation back and forth and talking about how similar the parts of the world really are that we work in. I think one thing that this whole process has brought to mind for me is just how important it is to take up space in our fight for inclusive democracy. Like the Erich Zeigner House is such an amazing project, in part because it does have that historical grounding and it is a place that you can go to. I think we're really lacking that in the Pacific Northwest. And I think this has really spurred me to think more about what it means to have a place in the landscape that's devoted to this work.
Wow, that's cool. Raymond, what do you have?
Yeah, well, I'm always amazed at just the energy that's in the civic projects in the United States. I mean, a lot of the ability of Americans to self-organize and get things on the books is always we take a more administrative approach to things in Germany, and everything has to be properly accounted for. I think though that there's a lot that we can learn from some of the broad-based civic activities that you're involved in, Kate. But what I found so fascinating when we started to go back and forth was just this kind of similarity between the Wild West and the Wild East, and how these spaces have become like canvases for projecting right-wing future scenarios.
Raymond, did I understand also that sort of the leadership development approach that the Western State Center does is something that's of interest to folks at Erich Zeigner House?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Because that's what we need to be doing, of course, when we have this student project. What happens to students afterwards, right? We should empower them, to get involved and to strive for leadership positions and influence society.
Great. Okay, Dan, what do you got next?
There's a question about the typical member of a far-right group. We learned from January 6th, some people involved in this were in the military, some were members of the middle class. Is education level irrelevant to who joins? We touched upon this a little bit earlier with the question about the economics of it, but do you have college graduates and people with graduate degrees involved in this too? And
Kate looks ready, so I'm going to go to Kate.
Sure. Yes, I guess it's really multifaceted. And if I'm thinking about the German far-right movements, I think it's very multifaceted as well. A lot of us used to think of this in terms of suits versus boots, right? Like, who's the Richard Spencer who's out there propagating these ideas in a New York Times interview versus kind of the skinheads on the ground who are carrying out that violence in their communities. The mainstreaming of far-right ideas is really a growing problem in the United States, because we are seeing people from all sectors of society getting involved in different versions of this. I would really caution against stereotyping or thinking that there's a typical member. These are groups and ideas that try to recruit from all segments of society because that assists with their political goals, and they will find takers on that particular deal all over the place, frankly. So I always think it's quite dangerous for people to be zeroing in on the idea that these are uneducated people, you know, that these are people who just don't know better. Some of them know better, but they choose worse, and we shouldn't leave that out in our planning.
Raymond,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I think it's the same story as everywhere else. It's the suits that are calling the shots, and the suits are looking for boots to do their dirty work. I feel a lot of these common people that gravitate to the right are being instrumentalized, their aspirations are being catered to, but that it really is there's really a lot of suits ideology and right-wing idealism that is going into these movements. And it certainly is not, simple thinking, but it's a worldview. It's a worldview, and it's a worldview that goes back a long time, and it has a long history, and it's unfortunately still with us.
Great, thank you. Dan, you want to try another one?
Well, it had to do, you brought up the question of territory, that the Aryan nation had their own compound, right? When you were growing up in the 90s. And Raymond, you talked about liberated areas in Saxony. There's a sense in which all of these groups on either side have a sense of literally carving out their own turf. What can be done about that? What's the answer? Is the safe space something really all the more important because of that you talked about, Kate?
Yeah, I think one of the things that can be done about this, and we're actually seeing a lot of resettlement of individuals in the United States right now. They're moving to places that they feel better suit their ideology, and where they feel that they'll have an easier time shaping local culture and politics to fit with their far right ideas. That's happening right now. And it's a little bit frightening. One of the best things we can do, I think, is prepare local communities with the information that they need to start pushing back, and really forming a counterweight to that type of thing. It does make it incredibly important that we're thinking about what is the gathering place for people who are opposed to this stuff. You don't want to find yourself in a town where every other pub you walk into, you're worried about having a frank conversation with the person you're going out for a beer with, because who knows who could be listening in, right? And at this point, that's the sense that some of the folks have in local communities who we work with. So, yeah.
And this idea of territoriality is, of course, very core to an ideology that is based on a biological view of humanity, where it comes down to who can conquer a space and keep it, right? This is a part of social Darwinism, and the strong shall inherit the earth, right? And the weak are pushed to the side. So this is a very territorial approach, and I think one has to, take up the fight. We try to do it in terms of historical space and not to cede historical space to the right. But it also, has to take the physical form of being present out there, and I think it's a question of visibility, okay? To be visible and to show yourself and not to be cowed and not to cede any space. Yeah.
Well, there was an earlier question that I neglected from Peter Klein that speaks to this, where he asked, when young people work on Jewish history in Germany, there are quite a few from the right who say, yes, in order to prevent persecution, we have to separate ethnic or religious groups from each other. The best thing you could learn from Nazi history is ethnic homogeneity. How can we train young people not to be helpless in this situation?
I'm not sure I quite understood that.
The idea, if I understood it, is precisely because of the problems you've been discussing, the right wing is saying the answer is separating. The answer is having your own territory. The answer is being homogenous ethnically and not mixing. So you have all these ethnic groups coming into Germany, and you have Islamophobia in the United States, and you have racism. How can we train young people not to be helpless in this situation?
Well, I think, there's an alternative model. This whole idea is predicated on the idea that there can be no peaceful coexistence, together. That somehow there is this clash of cultures. This is intellectually, much discussed concept, as if, being different means that we have to, fight each other, right? As if we cannot share space. I think we share space with others, with people who are different, and that's an entirely different model. Okay, and I think that's a much more gratifying world to live in, and I think young people are, as susceptible as ever to that, positive idea of togetherness, and that's what we have to offer: an alternative vision, an alternative model of what a society should be.
Yeah, an alternative narrative almost.
And there are a lot of historical examples of this, okay? And historical examples where it has worked, where religions have coexisted. Go back to, Spain in the Middle Ages, or, there are parts of the world part of the world which many people may not know as well, but the Indian state of Kerala, where there is a wonderful coexistence of religions. People share in each other's celebrations, take part in pilgrimages, common pilgrimages, to the saints of the other religion. Okay, so there are enough examples historically where it has worked, but it has also been at peril and it has been destroyed. Okay,
makes sense. Kate, you can answer if you want. Otherwise, I'll go to our last question. Up to you, whatever you like.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say about this is that we also have a lot of historical and current examples of what it looks like when people whose daily lives are lived together are torn apart in the name of this very vague and, really not practical at all concept of ethnic homogeneity. We know what this looks like.
It's also
in practice.
Also genetic bullshit, right?
Yes, of this kind of assumes that we aren't all in some ways, very similar. So you can take it in that direction. You can always say, what are you even talking about? My parents are two people who a generation ago would have been considered ethnically and religiously different. Now I'm just a regular original flavor white person. So there's that direction. But then there's the fact that, you know, in the United States, we know what Chinese exclusion looked like in the Pacific Northwest. There were thriving communities that were driven out. We know what it looks like that Native peoples were taken and pushed off of their own lands. And for me, I would rather live through the messy process of trying to get along than live through the process of trying to create a separation where it never belonged.
Great. So I think I'm going to call that a wrap. I think we have one more question, but I know we had said to a few people that we'd finish by 30 minutes after the hour. So I think we're going to leave it there because I think, you know, that was a really good set of notes to end on, right? Race as a concept is not biological, and that, you know, there have been plenty of periods when people have been able to share and coexist, which is, I think, where we want to get to. So let me do what I did before. Let me thank Kate and Raimund for the lively discussion, explanations of your work, and you know, for your work in general. Thank you so much for joining us. Oops, I don't know where that's from. But thank you everyone else for joining us. I think that's a celebration maybe for a nice event. And I hope you all will join us again in future events. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. This was great.
Yes, thank you so much.
You bet.
Yes.
Okay. And thank you everyone else who attended.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.